So I've had a quick look around the model and I need to just add a little bit more definition around this area. So I'm going to divide this edge. Now I'm going to work on the belly. So I need to bring this edge down and then I can continue the loop. I'm going to keep these verts floating some way off the body because when I do a subdivision on it, that's like a turbo smooth, the model will tend to collapse somewhat, so it will shrink in. It's also a lot easier to spot the verts when they're floating off the surface. This is the stomach, so I've worked down to the symmetry line, then I'm going to go up to the neck, and after that I'll do the tail. I will need geometry to build into this shoulder, but for the moment I will just leave it with the bare minimum geometry to represent this sternum, and then if I need to subdivide later I can do. I'm going to continue along this symmetry line from the neck to the lower jaw. So I've reached a point where the geometry is getting reasonably close together. So what I will do is I will weld these verts up so that these surfaces are connected. So with the two vertices selected, I'm just collapsing them. I will need to refine this area where the high poly jaw protrudes. It can be tempting to try and connect everything up as you go, but I encourage you to focus on these essential areas of mesh flow and you can patch and fill in later. This lower pelvis area is very important. The geometric flow separates the legs from the body. As I start building this tail section, I'm mindful of the geometry that's been placed earlier. So I'm going to make sure that the new geometry I add lines up with the existing geometry. As the tail tapers, we're going to need less geometry. So this new section I'm creating, which at the moment is separate, will join the existing piece. I'm going to weld these two vertices and this will join these two sections. If we examine this mesh flow, you can see that this ring extends along to the end of the tail. And the new section will also extend to the end. But in this space, what will happen is the loop will end at this point, and this will be where a triangle is formed. I can edge extrude from here and then weld these verts. I can edge extrude from here and then set the vertices to the symmetry line, and I can use the bridge tool to create a quad that is across the gap. And using the bridge tool, I'll fill in the rest of this section. I'll just demonstrate the difference between setting a vertex to the origin and an edge to the origin. So I'm going to zero this edge, but this will have set the midpoint of the edge to the origin. The vertices, you can see, are not actually on their origin. At this point here, the jaw narrows quite significantly, whereas in this area, the high poly is protruding outside of the low poly. So I'm going to need to refine this geometry by adding an extra loop. I also need to add more definition between this upper jaw area and the lower jaw. I'm going to need to add more geometry, but I need to be careful how I do this. If I was to subdivide this ring, what would happen is I would add more geometry down at the shoulder joint. Adding new geometry where I don't need it is something to be avoided. What I want to do instead is I want to split this connection. If I double click this edge, it will select the loop, and I need to be careful because it runs off underneath the top jaw. I can just chamfer this and then delete the geometry that I don't need. I also need to take care that I clean up these n-gons. Just going to tweak these verts to make sure that I'm representing the underlying features and I've got enough geometry for the jaw lines. The reason I've put this extra loop in is if this jaw is going to animate, I want an area where I can have stretching without overall deformation. I'm going to bridge from the nose to the brow, and this new single quad doesn't match the geometry below. If I subdivide this quad once, I can add more geometry. This gives me another vert, and I could potentially weld this to form a continuous surface. More importantly, I need to match the contours of the high poly, so I'm going to need to add even more geometry, again by subdividing this quad. I need to fix the verts that are on the symmetry line, make sure they're on Y0. If I just mark this missing area with a border, you can see that it's not very tidy. I have what effectively is going to be a quad and a triangle. At this stage, this is fine. When you're sketching out the mesh flow, try not to get too distracted in areas that aren't significant. I will have the same problem in this area. I need to divide this quad in order to get the silhouette, and the gap it will leave will be 5-sided. In other words, there'll be 5 edges. I'm just going to finish up the tail next. I'm extruding every other section and then bridging between them. I mentioned earlier that I might need more geometry in order to connect this sternum to the shoulder. So I've subdivided this quad, and this new edge will form the basis of the top of the shoulder on the inside, and then I will edge extrude to form the inside of the arm. This is the arm almost complete. So I've concentrated on the main area of mesh flow, and I've made sure that the mesh flow between the left side and the right side match. The next stage is the rear leg. At this stage, I have all of the major features and contours represented in the mesh flow. I can now start filling in the model by completing obvious areas of mesh flow. If we select this edge of the triangle that I'm left with, we can see where the loop goes, and it runs off into this chin. If I select another edge, you can see that it runs to the symmetry line at the back of the skull. And this last edge runs to the eye socket, which is also a triangle. And if I connect this edge, you can see that we've turned these two triangles into two quads. So we've improved this mesh flow. Once I have one side of the model complete, I'm almost ready to put the symmetry on. But first what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the open edge, all of those verts need to be on Y0. So I'm going to set the Y coordinate to 0, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it planar along the Y axis. And then I'm going to check some of the verts just to make sure that they are on Y0. I'm going to add my symmetry modifier, and because my pivot is on the origin, the symmetry modifier should come out in the right place. I just need to set it to the y-axis. I can bake in the symmetry modifier by converting it back into an editable poly. I'm then going to sort the smoothing groups out by going into element mode, selecting all of the geometry, clearing out all of the smoothing groups, and then setting them all to 1. I'm adding one iteration of mesh flow with the turbo smooth, and this will enable me to examine how the mesh flow subdivides, and I can look at pinch points. You can see there's one here on the tail, which was caused by the reduction in the geometry using triangles. And note how this geometry flows around the shoulder joint. So using EdgeExtrude, I have a fairly good representation of the T-Rex. You have to remember that this is a modeling exercise, so we're not trying to recreate the T-Rex. What we're trying to do is understand how edge modeling works. And I also feel that it's important to point out that this is not a retopology exercise. This is not how retopology is done. If you practice this exercise, you should get pretty good at using EdgeExtrude for modeling.